Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video we are going to take a look at why read Bleak House by Charles Dickens. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? By the way, how do you like my new setup? It's not perfect, I know, but I think it's getting there. I think it's a bit better than sitting straight in front of a bunch of bookshelves. Or so my wife tells me. Bleak House by Charles Dickens is considered by a multitude to be his finest ever work. But whether you agree with that or not, one thing is definite, and that is Bleak House is a masterpiece of classic literature and deserves its place amongst the classics. Bleak House, as is typical with Charles Dickens' works, takes a shot at a particular institution or part of society of Victorian Britain which needs to be reformed in Charles Dickens' opinion. Remember, he always has a soft spot for the poor and often children, and a child features prominently in this book. Well, I say features prominently, he's actually sort of a bit part player. His name's Joe, but if you read the book, all of the other characters revolve around little Joe, the street sweeper. Now, specifically, the institution that Dickens is taking aim at in Bleak House is Chancery Court. Now, Chancery Court is a court that deals often with family legal matters, so inheritance. In fact, the book itself is about an inheritance suit, a case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, where an enormous amount of wealth is up for grabs, but there's a confusing amount of wills that have been left by the man who died, and it's been dragged on for years and years. Now, if you have done any background reading on Charles Dickens, you will know that the law is something quite close to his heart, as in to satirise and to ridicule, because early in his career as a journalist for a paper, he often went to the courts, Chancery Court especially, to report on the goings-on of the day. So he knew the institution really well. The law system of Chancery Court really needed to be changed. And there was a very specific reason for that. People would go to Chancery Court, like we say, to get inheritance matters settled. But back in Dickens' day, it was notorious for dragging out the lawsuits and consuming the estate in fees. One of the characters in Bleak House that Dickens has as sort of a cameo role in the background is a man called Mr. Gridley. He is based on a real character in Dickens' time. He's a man from Suffolkshire, I believe it was, and he was trying to get an inheritance of £300 that had been left to him. But at the time of Dickens' writing, 2/3 of that inheritance had already been used up by the lawyers trying to settle the case. Even worse, there was a farm, I think it was, for £12,000 inheritance, and the man who was trying to claim it, because it was dragging through Chancery Court for years and years, he almost went bankrupt, and they practically spent all of the estate in fees. So obviously something is horribly wrong with the system. It seems to serve only the lawyers, making them richer, and the Lord High Chancellor who is in charge of Chancery Court. So what's the book about? In Bleak House, there are two narrators. There is a third-person omniscient narrator who sort of sees things from the God position, knows everybody's thoughts and what they're up to. And then you've got a first-person narration by Esther Summerson, who is one of the main characters. There are two stories which are flowing through the book. Now, the first one starts with Lady Dedlock. What a great name. Typical Dickens name. She's bored and she's trapped in her aristocratic society. Lady Dedlock. And her husband is a Sir Leicester Dedlock. Now, at the beginning of the book, you see a little bit of legalese. There is a lawyer with Sir Leicester and with Lady Dedlock. His name's Tulkinghorn, and he's this sort of brooding eminence at the back, a pale spectre, a thin, hollow-cheeked, jaundiced gremlin of a character who sort of dogs the pages in the background and has an effect over everyone in the book, but in a sort of sinister way. Now, Sir Dedlock has bequeathed a lot of stuff to his wife in his will, and they're just going over an affidavit when Lady Dedlock notices the signature of one of the lawyers that had drawn up this certain document. And for a brief moment, an expression flickers across her face that she's shocked. But Tulkinghorn spots this. You see, Tulkinghorn is a repository of all the secrets of the aristocracy. He gains all of his power and his malevolent energy from knowing everything about the aristocracy. And he sees this flicker go across Lady Dedlock's face and he thinks she knows this lawyer. And he starts off investigating who this person could be and what the link is to Lady Dedlock. Partly because he's concerned with the Dedlock family's name, but also because he likes to collect every detail about the upper classes. Interestingly though, Lady Dedlock follows the same thread of the story because she wants to discover the person who left this signature as well. But we don't know why. Now, after that's set up, the story shifts somewhere else and we find that there is this huge lawsuit, the main thread of the whole book. Jarndyce and Jarndyce, this enormous inheritance which lots of people have tried to claim, loads of people have had a claim to it, but it's dragged on for so many years that people have died while waiting to have the claim settled in their favour. Now, two wards of court, Richard and Ada, have both been brought forward and they meet the Lord High Chancellor and they seem to be the best claimants now on the case. And they are attended to by a sort of governess called Emma Summerson, who I've said is a first-person narrator in the book. And as the book progresses, you see how the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case has an effect on Ada and Richard, how they approach it differently, and how they're advised by Esther and by a man called John Jarndyce to not pin all of their hopes in the case and getting money from the case. As you expect with Charles Dickens, there is a whole pageant of characters going on through this book. The book is around 800 pages long, but you have those sublime names. You have Mr. Turveydrop, you have Mrs. Jellaby and Mrs. Pardiggle, you have the old madwoman Miss Flight, you have Skimpole and Smallweed. Now, if you want to know how the court case works out, and you want to know who the mysterious signatory was that Lady Dedlock saw the name of and blanched pale, then you'll have to read the book. But now I would like to tell you, if I may, why I think you should read Bleak House. If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you will know that there is a phrase that I frequently use, and that is, there is nothing new under the sun. Bleak House draws this out yet again. It is a sensible, careful, and provoking look at a nation's follies. Bleak House gives you a bird's eye view of the institutions of a nation that should be serving its populace, but how disreputable and irresponsible these institutions are. And this is something you see through all of history, right back to the time of Egypt. This all happens. Of course, there has to be government, but how it's set up is not fair and yet is perceived as the only way of doing things. But at the same time, thanks to the second narration from Emma Summerson, you compare it to the emotions and the needs and the innate feelings that all human beings are born with. But Dickens really strikes out. There's a particular part of the book, a paragraph, I'm not going to read that one because it's the message of the whole book, and I think if you read it you will spot it. But this is really satire from a shotgun through the forehead. He takes on the self-serving institutions of the land. He takes on the unconcerned government of the day, who talks about helping those in need, but never gets anything done. He talks about the disconnect between the fashionable elite and the world of the common person and the poor, whom they seem to have no interest in or even any awareness of. He also takes a shot at social justice movements and evangelical movements, which in and of themselves are worthy ideas, but he highlights the hypocrisy of what they're doing when there's so much to be done near at hand. All of these things exist today. When you read Bleak House, even though it was written in 1852, so about 170 years ago. Now, even though it was written that long ago, you will sympathise with the things that Dickens talks about. You will recognise them. And it should give us pause for thought, to think in 170 years, hardly anything has changed. Some things have improved, but the root causes are still broken and malformed. And it brings to mind that quote, "It does not belong to man to direct his own step." The case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, you begin to realise, is not only long and drawn out, but it has a poisoning effect on those around it. In fact, Dickens uses the word jaundice quite a lot through the book. If you think of it, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, or jaundice and jaundice. Jaundice is a sickening, a paling, a poisoning of the bloodstream. And that's what he's saying Chancery Court, this institution, and by extent a lot of other institutions, are actually doing to people who put their faith in them. And this is the thing. If you want to get an inheritance, you have to go to the courts. And you go to the courts fully expecting what? Justice. That's what we think the law is about. But of course, what he shows here with this myriad of lawyers, this wigglomeration, is that the law is about the law and not about justice. And do you know that has not changed one iota? And we get to see it from the eyes of these two young people, Richard and Ada, and what effect it begins to have on them. Now, there are a lot of other characters around Chancery Court who all have these complaints and things that they're trying to have settled too. And you can see that it's slowly grinding them down. As the book develops, it becomes almost like the old-fashioned press yard. If you don't know what the press yard is, it was a form of execution and torture in the jails of the 19th century and 18th century. A prisoner could be laid on the floor and a heavy stone put in his chest, and slowly they'd add a few more stones until it was almost like being constricted like a python. It would slowly crush you. Imagine how painful it was to breathe. Well, the book stacks like that. You feel this weight pushing down on anyone associated with the Chancery Courts. But it is all lightened and given a bit of mystery by the second story ring through it and the humanity of Emma Summerson. When you approach it thinking of that, it is a phenomenal piece of literature. I'd like to read you a few bits from the book to give you an idea both of the writing style and the message that Dickens is getting across. Now, this is not a spoiler in any way because it doesn't tell you actually where the book's going, but it gives you an idea of the message that Dickens is trying to get across, and see if you don't agree that this is the kind of thing that's happening today. Richard Carston, one of the characters, he's not a massive character in the book, but he's one with the claim on the Jarndyce case. He's really excited about the money that they might make. And Ada, the other ward of court who's got a claim in the case, says to him, "But I'm afraid that if we trust to it, it will make us unhappy." "But, my Ada, we are not going to trust to it," cried Richard. "We know it better than to trust it. We only say that if it should make us rich, we have no constitutional objection to being rich." Now, just from that snippet, can you see what Richard's attitude is? It's like many of us today. There's the chance that he might get money. Ada is saying we would be careful not to put our hopes in that. Now, he tacitly pays lip service and says, oh yes, we shouldn't trust that it will work out. But if it should, what does that tell you about his heart and his real thinking? He's thinking, we're going to be rich. The courts will bring us justice and give us this inheritance, and we will suddenly become rich beyond our wildest imaginations. You see these two different takes, cautious and paying lip service to caution, but trusting the system. And this is the critical thing that Dickens gets across. Not only are the institutions inept in his day, but people still prolong them, keep them, and put their trust in them, despite their regular failing. This is borne out even further in the book. I'll read you the next bit. Another of the characters, called John Jarndyce, an older man who himself was linked to the case, but will have nothing to do with it because he sees it as poisonous, tries to give advice to the young people involved. Speaking of Richard to Ada, John Jarndyce says this: "It is a terrible misfortune, little woman, to be ever drawn within the influences of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. I know none greater. By little and little he has been induced to trust in that rotten reed, and it communicates some portion of its rottenness to everything around him." Remember, all this time, the inheritance money that's up for grabs is being used to pay for the case, and has been doing so for years. It enriches the lawyers. And Jarndyce has said, it's anyone that comes near it. It's not a good thing. It's rotten. And people end up trusting in it. And that's what this young lad's done. And then he goes on to say this, and this is Dickens' message to all of us from 170 years ago. Esther Summerson, who is like the governess for the two young wards of court, she says, "Well, I hope Richard will learn by experience not to trust in these courts of law." And then John Jarndyce says this: "There are not many grown and matured men living while we speak, good men too, who, if they were thrown into the same court as suitors, would not be vitally changed and depreciated within 3 years, within 2, within 1. How can we stand amazed at poor Rick? A young man so unfortunate cannot at first believe, who could, that Chancery is what it is. He looks to it, flushed and fitfully, to do something with his interests and bring them to some settlement. It procrastinates, disappoints, tries, tortures him, wears out his sanguine hopes and patience thread by thread. But he still looks to it, and hankers after it, and finds his whole world treacherous and hollow." Isn't that amazing writing? That when people put their faith, one, in riches, there is that message, but most importantly for this book, when people put their faith in the institutions, thinking they will bring justice, they're set up to do what is right, well, realization will slowly dawn on them that that's not how it works, and it can literally poison a soul. Hence, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, or Jaundice and Jaundice would be more accurate. It's poisoning the blood of life. Dickens also takes shot at other institutions, particularly just the entire makeup of Great Britain and how rewards and offerings are given out by the government and by the aristocracy, and who actually benefits. Remember, as has just been read, John Jarndyce has just said that despite it failing Rick still looks to the courts thinking they will eventually get me justice, they'll bring a settlement. Dickens now points in another area of government which does the same kind of thing, which fails people. There's a little account about a doctor. No spoilers again. He's such a insignificant background character you'll forget him by the end of the book, but he serves Dickens' purpose in this one little transcript, as it were. There's been some kind of disaster at sea, and there's this good doctor, this physician on board who has survived, but he did amazing wonders out there to help people. And Dickens will use this little example to put a big pin in the balloon of fair government and to show that institutions serve themselves. I'll just read you about the doctor now, and it's being said by a sort of nutty old woman called Miss Flight, who keeps lots of birds. She says, "He is safe, the doctor. An awful scene. Death in all shapes, hundreds of dead and dying, fire, storm and darkness, numbers of the drowning thrown upon a rock. There and through it all, my dear physician was a hero, calm and brave through everything, saved many lives, never complained in hunger and thirst, wrapped naked people in his spare clothes, took the lead, showed them what to do, governed them, tended the sick, buried the dead, and brought the poor survivors safely off at last. My dear, the poor emaciated creatures all but worshipped him. They fell down at his feet when they got to the land and blessed him. The whole country rings with it. Stay, where's my bag and documents? I've got it there. You shall read it, you shall read it." So this woman is really excited about the heroics of this doctor who's just been good and actually saved people. Something you get a lot of in Bleak House, common people helping other people. But then this woman expects that this doctor, for such a great deed, which the whole nation knows about, will get some kind of reward. In fact, she says what reward she expects. She says to John Jarndyce, "My dear, my brave physician ought to have a title bestowed upon him, and no doubt he will. You are of that opinion?" So because of the heroics of this doctor, Miss Flight thinks, well, he's got to be given a title, a peerage, for saving so many people and being such a wonderful person. Don't you think so, Mr. Jarndyce? And Jarndyce says something back which is just remarkably telling about the way things are set up. He says, "That he well deserves one, yes. That he would ever have one, no." "Why not, Fitz Jarndyce?" she asked rather sharply. I said, it was not the custom in England to confer titles on men distinguished by peaceful services, however good and great, unless occasionally when they consisted of the accumulation of some very large amount of money. Isn't that the most damning indictment of an execrable government? That a man who saves many, he won't get a peerage, you don't get any honours for doing peaceful things unless you accumulate wealth along the way. Do you see how Bleak House matches even today? That nothing is new under the sun. Institutions serve themselves, governments serve themselves, the elite and fashionable create their own world, but the common person has to keep on struggling. Finally, to show the broad attack that Dickens is actually taking on, he also talks about the slums of London. There's a place that epitomises them, which is called Tom All Alone, and it's just the name of a group of slums. It is always in Dickens' concern to champion the cause of the poor and the downtrodden. He grew up poor, and he knew the slums of London. He knew the hardship. He knew the starving children in the street. He knew 2-year-olds being raised by 4-year-olds in rags, penniless, abused. And Tom All Alone, this group of slums, epitomises this for Dickens, and he has a shot at the noble institutions of the governance of the land. And he says this about a sunrise happening as it lights up these slums. "The day begins to break now, and in truth, it might be better for the national glory even that the sun should sometimes set upon the British dominions, than that it should ever rise upon so vile a wonder as Tom." Do you understand that? There's the famous phrase, isn't there, about the British Empire. It dominated a quarter of the globe, and the phrase was, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," because as night is appearing somewhere, the sun is rising on another part of the world that's owned by Britain or conquered by Britain. Dickens is saying, that is part of the pride of the British people, that the sun never sets on the British Empire. He's saying it would be better that the sun did set on part of the British Empire rather than it rise and shed light on the abysmal conditions of the poor of London. And that is what is so brilliant about Bleak House. Dickens does not pull his punches. He absolutely lambasts the law court, and things did change thanks to Dickens' work, just like it had an effect with Oliver Twist. Bleak House had an effect. But it wasn't just the law courts, the governments, the hoi polloi. You will see 2 social justice reform movements going on at this time, which are noble, but Dickens shows the hypocrisy and the error of a lot of those who have got caught up in it. But I won't tell you how. You'll see that when you read the book. But today, is there a disconnect between the world of fashion and the world of the ordinary person? Do the courts serve justice, or do they only serve law and lawyers? Has human government got to the point where it does everything with the milk of human kindness for its people? Or is it just the same as in 1852, when it talked a lot about it, but never got anywhere, where it had great ambitions and noble schemes, but never came to fruition? Nothing changes under the sun. Social justice movements, why don't they work? You will find part of the answer in Bleak House. Because how many movements have there been that have failed, gone so far and then gone off track? but never fully accomplish their ends? The answer is in Bleak House. So that is why I think you should read Bleak House. I hope you've enjoyed this video and it inspires you to go through Bleak House. If you've already read Bleak House, leave your comments of various ideas that you spotted in the book. Or if you haven't, tell me when you're going to, and then message me afterwards and tell me what you think. Come back to this video and leave your comments or email me directly. Until next time, I wish you joy in your reading.